Thank you very much, Ellen, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone here. And let's say, if we bring my presentation up again, it's I'm going to speak a little bit differently than Ellen than maybe I'd originally intended to, but and speak a little bit differently, I think, than the level that Cohen was at as well, because I think we're at a different moment on when it comes to whole farm sustainability, and the way that we should be thinking about these are different. So if you go to the next slide, what I want to do today is speak about kind of the challenges, the opportunities, and the way forward. And if you go to the next slide again, I will say that kind of my starting point is this I think this graphic that speaks to the fact that we're in a space, and arguably we've always been in a space, but it's more true now that many things can be true at the same time. The world is awful. The world can be much better. The world is much better. I stole this from a book by Hannah Ritchie. Highly recommend it to everyone. But that is how I think about it. And I think over the last decade, that as sustainability's ramped up, where we think about which one of these we think about sustainability in agriculture through has changed. And so if you go to the next slide, so let me start with some of the challenges. First and foremost, what is it that we are talking about? We are talking about agriculture sustainability, but it has been a real struggle, I think, to really understand what do we mean. In the past, I think carbon has been front and center. There's been this desire to say we need to think about it kind of as these three stools: economic, environmental, and social sustainability. But really, these are apples and oranges. And so how we understand the space that we're in, how we think about the language that we're using. I think even if you think about my presentation, you'll see that I'm going to pivot between thinking about whole farm sustainability in this broad sense versus whole farm sustainability in the environmental sense. And that creates a challenge if you go to the next slide around what exactly is it that we're talking about, and what are we measuring when we think about measuring whole farm sustainability. I'll talk about it at the end, but a lot of this has been informed as I've watched the work of the National Index on Agri-Food sustainability. But when we think about sustainability metrics and when we think about measuring what exactly it is that we're talking about, we need to find things that are credible, comparable, relevant, recent, transparent, and fit for purpose. And I actually think that that last piece is the hardest of them all to think about. And Cohen talked about some of the work that the OECD is doing, and I think when I think about that work, it's really focusing on the top end of this list. Understanding what that fit for purpose piece is the hardest of them all. And if you go to the next slide, um, it really what we talk about and what we measure and what we think about when we think about sustainability really depends on where we're talking about. Is it about a field? Is it about a value chain? Is it about an ecosystem? Depends on what we're talking about. Is it carbon? Is it environment? Is it sustainability? Is it economic issues? Are these practices or outcomes? Depends on why we're talking about what we're talking about. Is this, as Cohen talks about, corporate reporting and scope 3 emissions? Is it about attaining a market premium? Is it a market access issue? Is it a domestic policy issue? Depends on who we're talking to and talking with. The needs and perspectives of supply chain business is very different than the needs of perspective as a farmer themselves. And ultimately, it depends on how we're measuring and how we're thinking about what we're doing. And this creates this challenge, if you go to the next slide, around perception. And I think it really is this dynamic that kind of where you sit really depends on what you see when it comes to sustainability and this kind of challenging, changing landscape. And I think people's perception of this issue has changed drastically over the last year. And it changes because of those risks that Ellen alluded to earlier. And it's created the space where I think when we think about sustainability issues, we need to be thinking about them and talking about them in a different context than we were before. And if you go to the next slide, that is very much in the front of the political landscape that the policy world operates in. We have a prime minister in Canada today that wrote a book about values, but the first thing he did as prime minister was axe the proverbial carbon tax. That is a space where um, it's reflected that change in that landscape and that different world that we're in. But it's not just that government. There are some direct impacts to agriculture. I think if you look at what the opposition leaders talked about for the clean fuel regulations, they underpin the biofuels market in Canada. That's very important for Canadian farmers. That is on the chopping block under a conservative government. And I think you look at this evolution that we're in, where we were in a space a decade ago when the government maybe 5 years ago, when the government was rolling out significant investments through the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, was doing all of these really putting sustainability, environmental sustainability first and foremost, launched a sustainable agriculture strategy, but all of that has fallen away, and we haven't seen cuts to off-calf, but we did see in the budget a reference to the on-farm, the Living Labs programs being cut. That's part of that scaling back of that investment, and this isn't just something that's happening kind of at a broad government level. There's a graph from a study that the Simpson Center put out last year. They surveyed farmers in advance of the last federal election. You really do have to go down to the list to get to climate action and environmental sustainability as a political priority for farmers. And that certainly creates a challenging dynamic from a political perspective and a policy perspective. And then important to keep in mind, this isn't just about Canada. This is also not just about the US. We know the US is pulling back, but we've seen the European government pull back as well. And Ursula von der Leyen and her commission have reoriented and rethought, have put the Green New Deal on the table, put it on the chopping block. We see a strategic dialogue. And so even the European perspective is pulling back from where we see the, the sustainability going. And if you go to the next slide, ultimately, I think the biggest challenge with whole farm sustainability today are the practical realities of what exactly it is that we're talking about. Keeping in mind that it really does depend on how you define it, how you measure it. We're in this space where that center word cloud is from some survey work that we've done with farmers where we ask them open-ended questions about this. Yes, they see it as a sustainability issue, but they're talking about financial challenges. They're talking about the government. They're not necessarily talking about this as what works for them. And there's this ongoing perception that really, when we've talked about whole farm sustainability over the last decade, we've talked about governments needing to do things different, or farmers needing to do things differently in response to what governments are asking for. And the graph on the is from a study that was done by McKinsey, and I think it's an interesting study because it speaks to kind of the on the vertical axis, the share of adoption, the percent adoption of the practices. On the vertical axis, how these farmers perceive there to be a positive ROI, and it's not should not be a huge surprise that those things that farmers perceive as having a positive return are the things that farmers are doing. But that has been a bit lost where I think that kind of that balance between what are the things that farmers see as good for them that we should be encouraging them to do more of versus what are those things that are more challenging has been something that we haven't grappled well with in the past. And if you go to the next slide, I'll start to talk a bit about the opportunities. First and foremost, in this risky world that we're in, it's how do we think differently about how do we see whole farm sustainability as an added value? This is out of some work that we've done around risks in the sector. Was looking last year around the future, and this is a quote from an event that we hosted. But the future lies in value-added products, skills, and technology, not relying on old models. We heard that Canada has a great reputation, but not a great strategy to get our products around the world. I think that there's this opportunity to better incorporate sustainability within that model and thinking about how do we change? How do we add more value to the sector? And how do we leverage sustainability to do it? If you go to the next slide, in that same report, we asked people in the sector around risks in agriculture and food. And yes, extreme weather is the number two risk. But if you look across down that top priority or the top risk list, making our farms more sustainable and embracing whole farm sustainability can go a long way to helping farmers mitigate and manage all of these risks that they face. It can help address concerns around import affordability. It can help address concerns around commodity price volatility. It can certainly help address adaptation to extreme weather. But we need to think about it more again as an asset, as a tool to help farmers manage and better mitigate the risks that they face. If you go to the next slide, I want to highlight some work that we did with the Global Forum for Farm Policy and Innovation. This is a collaboration between CAPI and other funders around the world. We started this work several years ago, and it is worth acknowledging that the trade landscape is very different today than it was when we started. But we looked at the role of trade and sustainability, how those two things go together. These reports are available on our website. I encourage you to go take a look at them. But out of the first work that we did that was done at the OECD on the margins of their agriculture work, we talked about how do we do more to enhance food systems through outcomes-based approaches? How do we look at encouraging increased global cooperation? How do we do a better job optimizing trade to make sustainable agriculture to make agriculture more sustainable and more profitable, and how do we use data and technology to do it. If you go to the next slide, this is from a second engagement that we did in the United States, but we really wanted to go a step further to look at how do we do more to develop a global trade and agriculture sustainability framework? How do we build support and collaboration around this initiative? Now, on all of these things, it really is worth acknowledging that the trade landscape has changed immensely since we've done this work, which is really not too long ago. But it is a challenge that we've got to navigate. How do we find a way for the future? The most recent report that we put out through GIFBI last year was around common ground. And I will say that I do think that there's this opportunity for trade and sustainability to be some of that common ground as we think about how do we build more support for that middle country alliance globally that can breathe more life into the trade system that's so critically important, and to do it in a way that's good for sustainability in the future. Go to the next slide, please. But ultimately, the biggest opportunity when we think about this is what does this mean for farmers, and how do we make whole farm sustainability work more for farmers? Again, I think that this conference itself has explored this theme for years, the benefits of this. Try to highlight just kind of the many different ways that we're thinking about this. Dairy Farmers of Canada has got a net zero by 2050 plan that looks at how this works. Farm Credit Canada has done some great work around productivity and the benefits of improving on-farm productivity to help sustainably feed the world. There's the benefits of EU certification that the Canola Council promotes because it's good for farmers in accessing the EU biodiesel market. And going back to some survey work that we've done, this is something that farmers see and know and are challenged with. And so we asked farmers what are top environmental issues for their farm operation. Soil health comes far and away in this survey as the top concern that they've got. But soil health is one of those things where if we can fix soil health, we can do a lot of things to improve a lot of different environmental outcomes. If you go to the next slide, out of that survey, one of the things that we did was we tried to embrace this idea of sustainable improvers. We looked at who were the farmers, going back to those three circles that I started off with, who see themselves today as good environmental stewards, but also see that there's room for improvement. I think too often when we think about whole farm sustainability, and kind of the perception of farmers, it's either one or the other. Farmers either think that they've done enough, or they think that there's much more to do. And so we tried to identify which farmers think that both of those things are true. And I think the good news is that the majority of farmers do see that to be the case. In some cases, depending on how you chop them up, more than others. But by and large, across the board, we are in this space where Canadian farmers do recognize that they are effective stewards, but there is more that they could do. And so I use that as the launching point to go to the next slide to think about the way forward. Certainly, if you think about this in the policy context, I think that there's two interesting examples over the last decade that have talked about agriculture and the environment and set two different tones. If you go back to the original Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy plan that the Trudeau government released, that is when they unveiled their 30% emission reduction target. I think it really spoke to agriculture as a problem that needed to be solved. If you look at the language in the document, if you look at what followed, it was seen that fertilizer emissions are a real problem and need to be driven down. The approach in the methane strategy was very different. First and foremost, there was not much of a commitment made to reduce methane. The target was in other parts of the economy. But the language that was used and was thought about spoke to the challenges that farmers face, the need to take time and build support for it. And I really do think my sense at a distance, looking at those two approaches, is that lessons were learned from that first strategy and the blowback that the government faced and were incorporated into the methane strategy. And I also think it reflected some of the work that some of the people that have been involved with this conference have done over the years, really better understanding what methane looks like in Canadian agriculture. And I think that there was an impact on that report by some of the good work that the officials from Agriculture Canada have done. If you go to the next slide, a big part of that way forward will be the next policy framework. Go back 5 years ago when governments released the Guelph Statement. Climate change and the environment was one of the blocks of that. It was really seen to be this environment, economic, social approach to sustainability. We're in a different world. It will be interesting to see what that plays. By all accounts, government's going to continue to invest in on-farm sustainability, but what that means, what that looks like, will change going forward. I referenced earlier the National Index on Agri-Food Performance. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I'll say that again, that is a space where people have come together, this coalition of 150 plus partners, to work on how do we better frame, understand, and report on the progress that's being made across a variety of different indicators that speak to. Oh, sorry, if you go to the next slide, that speak to the position that we're in. And so that work continues, but that collaborative approach is going to be important. If you go to the next slide, when I think about some of the lessons that have been learned from that national index approach that speak to lessons that we can learn as a sector and an industry about whole farm sustainability, it's that really, collaboration is a strength and a challenge. Clarity of purpose, why we are doing this, is really important. The idea of continuous improvement is key, right? So we're going to continue to refine and work on this. The data is difficult. I think Cohen spoke to some of those challenges. There's a need for simplicity in how we think about this. These are complex challenges, but the more that we can understand how simple they are is important. Interpretation is really a challenge. And a lot of the time, we cannot understate how important the ability to clearly communicate what we're talking about is really important. And clear communication can matter as much as the soundness of the science and building support and understanding for it. And I think my second last slide is just to say, when I think about, if you go to the next slide, I really think that when we think about the way forward on whole farm sustainability, there are some simple things that matter. First is that farmers are the first line of sustainability. So I took out the word defense because we've been using this line in work that we've been doing on farm business risk management. And we talk about farmers are the first line of defense when it comes to risk management. Farmers are also the first line of defense for sustainability. We need to understand that, embrace that. And because of that, we need to understand that solutions need to work for farmers. And you go back to that McKinsey graph, and it's clear those solutions that farmers see and understand will have the greatest traction. Different farmers need different solutions. The diversity of farms is quite a Canadian challenge that we face. And in so much of all of this, focus on outcomes, the sustainability outcomes is important. Policy can help, but it can hurt too, as we saw with the fertilizer target. And the bottom line is a line from Elizabeth on my team, who's done quite a bit of work. And it's this reality that whole farm sustainability scales when the system is coherent, incentives are aligned, and accountability is tied to where the sector, and I've added this part, and farmers need to be 5 and 10 years from now. And I'll just say, I think if you click through again, you'll see the image that's there is, I asked Copilot to give me an image of an on-farm, a sustainable Saskatchewan farm. If you click through to the next piece, hopefully that image will go away and you'll see the next one. Again, I think that there's this one thing to have this idea, but in reality, we are doing such good work, and things like the no-till practices that farmers are doing really matters. And so I will end back where I started if you go to the next slide, and that is that we are living in a world where all three things are true at the same time. We are not as sustainable as we should be, but we are much better than we've been in the past, and we can still be better yet if we continue to work on this in the future. So Ellen, hopefully that is a bit of a different spin on thinking on this, and look forward to the discussion and the Q&A.